and welcome to Muse to Madness. We're going to be spending some of our afternoon with Zelda Fitzgerald today, which is very exciting. And as most of you may know, this is all part of All Pueblo Reads, which is an annual event that we host in October here at the library. And it's basically a project designed to get everyone in Pueblo County reading the same book at the same time. And so we can have some discussions to promote literacy, encourage dialogue across social, cultural, and generational lines. This is the 10th year of the project. And in the past, we've done books like The Help by Catherine Stockett, Plain Song by Kent Harif, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And this year, it's The Paris Wife by Paula McLean. And we're really excited. Next Saturday evening, we're having our Book Lovers Black Tie Ball, where Paula will be our featured speaker for the evening. And then on Sunday afternoon, we also have her speaking, and it's free and open to the public. So we hope to see some of you there. But without further ado, I would like to introduce to this afternoon's guest, Zelda Fitzgerald. I would like to remind you that this program has 3 different parts. First, we're going to have a visit by Zelda Fitzgerald. Second, Zelda will take some questions from the audience, so as Zelda. And third, scholar and performer Deborah Connor will appear to answer questions from you. If you don't mind, can you turn off your cell phones or silence them completely so that we're not interrupted during this afternoon's performance? And now to our guest. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will join Zelda Fitzgerald in 1948 in Asheville, North Carolina. Once the flamboyant wife of the great jazz age writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, Zelda has been living at Highland Hospital, where she is receiving treatments for the mental illness that has haunted her for nearly 18 years. Zelda will take us on a journey through memory, describing her experiences with Scott during the glittering age of excess and the tragedy of their lives in the decade that followed.
I have been walking all day in the graveyard. The graves are all covered with weeping flowers that seem to come from dead eyes. Oh, death is so Oh, death is so very beautiful. In 100 years, you think it's the TV mic? Oh, death is so very beautiful. In 100 years, I wonder if someone will stand at my grave and ask if my eyes were blue or brown, and what became of Zelda Fitzgerald. I'm sorry there is nothing here to greet you but this empty shell. Sometimes now I have to say to people, hello, I'm Zelda Fitzgerald, graduate of half a dozen of the world's most expensive mental hospitals. I know I'm not what you expected. You came here thinking you would see that high-spirited young girl, the belle of Montgomery, Alabama, who scandalized the town of Montgomery with rumors of how she swam naked in the town pool. You came here to see the glamorous wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who took New York by storm in the 1920s, riding not in the taxicabs but on the hoods of them, who dove fully clothed into the fountains of Washington Square Park. Maybe Zelda doesn't even exist anymore after 18 years of treatments and mental hospitals. They give me powders made from the ovaries and the thyroid glands, injections of horse blood, injections of my own blood. I take morphine to help me sleep, belladonna for pain, and luminol to keep me constantly sedated. Life moves over me in a vast black shadow. You've come to see Zelda Sayer Fitzgerald, but I don't know where she is. Let me show you what remains of my life. A single battered suitcase that I carry with me from town to town, from hospital to hospital. All that is left of a marriage that the world saw as so glamorous and so enviable, of a life that was the toast of the world. Scott drank too often and too much. I carry his books with me now still, because they are the Scott and Zelda story, masquerading as fiction. Scott believed that every great writer has only 2 or 3 stories to tell, and he simply tells those same stories over and over again. These books were our lives together. Scott's first novel, This Side of Paradise, written when he was a young Princeton man, and it's the story of a young Princeton man like Scott himself, in love with a willful, tempestuous, and spoiled young woman. This is the book that made Scott Fitzgerald rich, made him acclaimed all over the world. When he wrote this, I said, our lives have all the iridescence of the beginning of the world. But it was also the beginning of Scott's long habit of using my letters, my diaries, conversations with my friends as material for his fiction. Oh, at first, it didn't matter much. I was flattered to be a character in one of Scott's novels. But later, I felt differently. When I was asked to write a kind of tongue-in-cheek review of one of Scott's books, I said this: Scott Fitzgerald, I believe that's what he calls himself, seems to believe that plagiarism begins at home. Oh, we were riding the wild winds of success when Scott published The Great Gatsby in 1925. J. Gatsby, a man in love with the American dream of wealth, success, and eternal love, who dies brutally for all of those illusions. Gatsby was a critical success. None other than T.S. Eliot said that this was the first step American fiction had taken since Henry James. But it was a commercial disappointment. Scott began drinking more and more to hide his sense of failure. He wrote in his notebooks, I drink because I am at the top of the second rates. With the arrival of the Great Depression, too, America's taste in literature changed. Suddenly, people wanted to read about sharecroppers and the poor, and Scott's stories of the good times just didn't seem to matter much anymore. It also became clear after my first breakdown in 1930 that I was not going to get well. Scott wrote, I left my capacity for hope along the little roads that led to Zelda's asylums. Every day grew more bitter and more sterile and more hopeless. Scott's confidence was at such a low ebb that it took him 9 years to write this next novel, Tender is the Night. It's the story of a brilliant and promising young psychiatrist whose life is ruined by his wife, by his insane wife. By now, Scott's long habits of using my letters, my diaries, even conversations now between my doctors and me had turned cruel. It was easy to see this book as an accusation that I was responsible for all of Scott's misery. And so, my friends, take a look at all that remains of the glorious life of Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. This is what we have left of all that glory. This is what we have left of all that money, the $400,000 we made with hard words and spent with easy ones. Nothing could have survived our lives. My doctors tell me that I must forget the past. But I keep remembering what Scott wrote at the end of The Great Gatsby, those final lines of the novel which read, "And so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Jazz Age, to the greatest, gaudiest spree in history. It was the age of miracles, the age of art, the age of excess, where everyone was rich together. I would like to introduce myself to you now. My name is Zelda Sayre Fitzgerald, former Southern Belle, and now America's original flapper. Now, a lot of people ask me, Zelda, what is a flapper? Well, here is how I describe her in some articles I wrote for McCall's magazine in 1925. A flapper is an artist of a particular kind. She wears her hair bobbed, and she wears her choicest pair of earrings. A flapper wears powder and paint simply because she doesn't need it. A flapper flirts because it is fun to flirt. A flapper has a great many admirers, most of them male, but a flapper doesn't really need admirers. She only needs crowds and parties. Now look at you. Some of you are looking positively embalmed. I want you to liven yourselves up a little bit. It's the 20s. We're here to have a good time. It's the decade of 1,000 parties. And it was at a party when I first met Scott Fitzgerald. I was just a young girl, barely 18 years old. I was at a country club dance in Montgomery. Scott was a young Army officer stationed nearby at Camp Sheridan. He'd come down that night for the dance, and he stood out on the edge of the dance floor and asked if anybody knew who I was. He stood out on the edge of the dance floor and asked if anybody there knew who I was. When he finally got up enough nerve to ask me for a dance, I said, "Well, I never make late dates with fast workers." But I did. Oh, I was the girl everybody knew and everybody talked about. I was so popular with the boys at Auburn University that they named a fraternity in my honor. They called it Zelda Sigma. It was claimed that the initiation rites to join that fraternity involved those young men traveling down from Auburn to my home in Montgomery, and they were required to kiss my
doorstep. Oh, I was a girl living on the cream at the top of the bottle. The other girls in Montgomery used to say that when Zelda Sayer came to a party, well, the rest of them just might as well go on home. You know, even after I got engaged to Scott, well, I was not the sort of girl to stay home on the weekends and just write letters to my fiancé. I was still living at home in Montgomery with my parents. Scott was living off in New York, and, well, I wrote letters to him, and I told him that I looked at our engagement ring every 5 minutes. But the truth was, I hardly ever wore it. Now, one weekend, and I don't exactly know how this happened, but one weekend I accepted the fraternity pin of a young golfer, a kind of pre-engagement arrangement, even though I was engaged to Scott. Well, very quickly I realized I should not have done what I did. So I took that fraternity pin and I wrote a letter. I wrote the letter explaining everything, how it happened, and I put that fraternity pin and the note in an envelope and I sent it off in the mail. The trouble was, I sent that note and that fraternity pin off to Scott by mistake. Oh, you can imagine the explosion that resulted. Scott said he was in love with a whirlwind and he had to spin a net big enough to catch me. Oh, I was a whirlwind, all right, virtually from the day I was born. When my parents sent me off to kindergarten at age 5, I came home after that first day and I said, school is worse than prison, and I had no intention of going back. They let me stay home then until I was 7. Later on, when I was a teenager and I was searching for a little excitement and a little adventure in that dreary old town of Montgomery, one day I called up the fire department and I reported that there was a fire at my house. And then I climbed up on the roof to await being rescued. When that young and handsome fireman arrived and he carried me off the roof and he put me down in the yard, he said, "Honey, where's the fire?" I said, "Well, it's right here, and it's just burning up my heart." You can see, I suspect, why I provoked my parents a great deal. And it was easy to provoke my daddy because Daddy was a judge, a member of the Alabama Supreme Court, very Southern and very proper. Daddy believed that a girl should only have her name in the newspaper 3 times. Once when she's born, once when she marries, and once when she dies. Well, I had a little different idea of what it meant to be a good girl. You know, good girls go to heaven, but bad girls go everywhere. Now, I got along a little better with Mama because, well, Mama's more high-spirited, more colorful, more like me. She named me Zelda after a gypsy queen in one of those romance novels that she was always reading. When I brought Scott home to meet my parents for the first time, well, they were decidedly unimpressed. You see, there were about 3 reasons why they didn't like Scott. First of all, Scott told them that he was going to be a famous writer. But in 1919, he hadn't published a single thing. That year, he wrote 19 short stories, but he received 122 rejections for them. It was enough rejections to wallpaper the walls of his apartment house. And that's what he did, and he bragged about it later on. The second reason they didn't think much of Scott was that Scott is a Yankee, a northern boy from St. Paul, Minnesota. When my mama found out that I was getting serious about a Yankee, well, she just thought it was outrageous. She said, "Honey, pass me the smelling salts. I'm going to go into a swoon." But worst of all, Scott is a Catholic. Well, he wasn't exactly practicing a Catholic, but he was a Catholic nonetheless. When Mama found that out, she said, "Well, it's going to take more than a Catholic boy. It's going to take more than the Pope. It's going to take God Almighty himself to make Zelda good." Well, I decided that I would take the question of whether or not I should become Scott's wife to the highest authority that I knew. That authority was Miss Francesca, the local psychic. On the day that Miss Francesca and I began to use the Ouija board to ask it questions about whether I should become Scott's wife, well, the only word that came up over and over again was the word dead, dead, dead. Well, I just decided to put all that out of my mind. And on April the 30th, 1920, I became the wife of Mr. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald in New York's St. Patrick's Cathedral, no less. Oh, it was just a small wedding in the rectory. And on that day, Scott was so nervous. He kept pacing back and forth and back and forth. It seemed he couldn't wait to get the ceremony started. So he started the whole thing early, before some of my family could even arrive. It seemed like Scott couldn't wait to whisk me off to that fancy Biltmore Hotel to begin our honeymoon. And do you know what we did then? Well, not just that. We went shopping. It was the beginning of our long habit of spending wildly and recklessly. You know, Scott used to light his cigarettes with rolled up $5 bills. He used to keep $100 bills stuck in his pocket in such a way that the numbers stood out and everyone could see how rich he was. He once went onto the streets of New York City and he had cashed in $100 in change and he threw it in the air and he said, it's money, and it's free." Oh, we were living by what our friend Dorothy Parker said were the two most beautiful words in the English language. What are the two most beautiful words in the English language? Check enclosed. Oh, those were the days of wild nights and headachy mornings. We lived like two children in a bright, unexplored barn. We lived in New York City for long months at a time in the best hotels. And we always lived near a good restaurant because I never learned to cook. When I was asked to contribute a recipe to a cookbook that someone was making called Recipes of Famous American Women, here is my recipe for breakfast. You go to the refrigerator and you get out the bacon and the eggs. And then you call the cook to come fry them for you. You serve them on gold plates. I was never the kitchen sort of person, if you know what I mean. I never really cared for doing laundry either. There was a time when if our clothes got dirty, well, we just threw them in the back of the closet and we went out and bought new ones. Oh, we were so carefree in those days. I once said, I never liked a room without an open suitcase in it because anything else seemed too permanent. We lived on the French Riviera. We lived out among the great Gatsby-like mansions on Long Island. We lived on the banks of the Delaware River in a 27-bedroom mansion called Ellerslie. The rooms in Ellerslie were so enormous that I had to have our furniture custom made because ordinary furniture just looked like little dollhouse furniture in those vast rooms. We were so important in the world that the newspaper man, William Randolph Hearst, he hired a newspaper reporter full-time just to follow us around and to report on everything we did. I'll never forget one journalist wrote, "Mr. Fitzgerald is a novelist, but Mrs. Fitzgerald is a novelty." Oh, Scott even had a little rhyme that he wrote about those days of public adoration. It goes like this. There was an orchestra, bingo, bango, playing for us to dance the tango. And the people all clapped when we arose for her sweet face and my new clothes. Sometimes I didn't know if we were real or if we were characters in one of Scott's novels. We lived, as Scott describes it in The Great Gatsby, amid the champagne and the whisperings and the stars. Sometimes we'd flutter down and we lived in Paris, a city that I loved so. Our friend Gertrude Stein said that in Paris in the 1920s, everyone was just 26 years old. It was in Paris that we first met Ernest Hemingway. Now, I never liked Hemingway from the beginning. I said that he was bogus, a fake, nothing more than a pansy with hair on his chest. You know that book that made him so famous, The Sun Also Rises? That's a book about nothing other than bullfighting, bull-slinging, and you get my point. When Scott first met Ernest Hemingway, Scott himself was a very famous writer. Hemingway was a nobody. No one had ever heard of him before. But Scott believed in Hemingway's talent, and he set about to promote him, introducing him to the right people and encouraging him in his work. But when Hemingway became more famous than Scott, he turned on him. He said bitter and cruel things about him. Did you realize that in the first published version of the story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, he names Scott in that story. He calls him poor Scott Fitzgerald. He says that he was wrecked. When Scott protested, he changed the character's name to Julian, but that didn't take away the hurt. He also mocked one of Scott's short stories that begins, "The rich are different than you and me." Hemingway said sarcastically, "Yes, Scott, they have more money." I only wish I had been able to tell him, "That may be true, Ernest, but few of them have had as many wives as you have had, or as many extramarital affairs." That was a long time ago. Whatever became of those good gone times, when we still believed in the philosophies of popular songs and a good summer hotel? Maybe like Icarus, we flew too close to the sun. I know that I shouldn't be away from the hospital, that they'll come looking for me before long. But it's oh so pleasant to be here with you and to be telling my story and how life was for us once. But before I have to leave, I'd like to keep on talking for a while. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to ask me, Zelda Fitzgerald, any questions that you might have. Is there anything at all that you might be curious about? Yes, dear.
Zelda, how were you diagnosed in the hospital?
How was I diagnosed in the hospital? Well, I had my first breakdown in 1930. I was 30 years old, born in 1900. Scott and I had been living abroad, and our friends noticed that I had begun to grow more vague, more distant, and more withdrawn. But the collapse began when I was in the flower market one day, and I believed that the flowers were talking to me. Later on, I thought that there were corpses walking the house. I had thoughts of killing my parents. I went, first of all, to a clinic in Switzerland, but it was not suited to treat me, so I went on to a French clinic. And there, Dr. Forel diagnosed me first with schizophrenia. But there's been over the years now, more than 18 years when I've been in and out of hospitals, there's been different diagnoses. Some doctors have felt that my troubles are all the result of having an unhealthy competition with my husband, that if I would be a better wife and a better mother, that I would be fine. One doctor felt that I might have a brain tumor. Another suspected that there was some sort of imbalance, a chemical imbalance in my body. And yet another doctor said that Scott's drinking provoked my troubles. It's a very dark time. Yes?
Did your parents ever come to like Scott?
Did my parents ever come to like Scott? I'm afraid that the things between Scott and my parents, the animosity has only grown worse. Because, you see, there's a lot of blame now. My parents blame Scott's instability, his lifestyle of moving from one place to another, and his drinking for causing my problems. Scott's family and Scott himself blames my own family background. You see, there have been a number of people in my family who have been troubled in the same way that I am troubled.
Did all of the prosperity come from Scott's books?
Did all the prosperity in our lives come from Scott's books? Well, you should realize that Scott made very little money from any of his novels apart from the first novel, This Side of Paradise. Most of Scott's money came as a result of his short stories. Scott was the highest paid short story writer in the world. A single short story by Scott Fitzgerald could command as much as $4,000. But Scott didn't like writing short stories. He felt that it was hack work, that it was beneath him. But nevertheless, that's what sustained us, that and loans from our friends and family.
You also were very artistic in two different ways, weren't you?
Was I artistic? Am I artistic in many ways? I am. I devoted myself to becoming a major ballerina. The problem was, I was 27 years old, and it was too late. I worked day and night, 10 hours a day practicing. Scott believed that was responsible for my breakdown, and he discouraged me from continuing in that career, although at one point I was offered a role in the San Carlo Ballet Company in Italy. But it would have meant that I would have to leave my family, leave my little girl Scotty, and live in Italy apart from her, so I refused to take that role. But I have also painted. Some of my paintings were on display at various galleries, most notably the Cary Gallery in New York City. And I myself, you may not know this, but I wrote my own novel in 1932 called Save Me the Waltz, and it was published by Scribner's. But before it was published, Scott was furious. He made 3 demands on that novel, on me and the writing of it. The first demand was that any reference to any character that resembled him had to be taken out. Keep in mind that I had appeared in various ways as characters in his novels for many years. The second stipulation was that the novel not be praised. He felt that it would upset my delicate emotional balance. And the third stipulation was that half of the royalties that my novel earned would go to Scribner's to repay Scott's debts to them. In the end, it didn't much matter. The novel didn't sell. It made only $120.93, and Scribner's never asked for any of the profits. Yes.
Could you tell us a little about your daughter?
Could I tell you a little bit about our daughter, Scotty? Well, I still think of her as a little girl. Do some of you ladies who have all grown-up daughters still think of them as little girls? Well, Scotty is all grown up now. She graduated from Vassar. She's married to a Washington, D.C. attorney by the name of Jack Lanahan. And recently she has produced 2 grandchildren for me. A little boy named Thomas, but we call him Tim, and a daughter named Eleanor. Is there anything else? The lady in the back?
How did you and Scott die?
How did I die? Well, I can recommend some very fine psychiatrists to you because you seem to be delusional. I am very much alive. Or has my bootlegger been giving you some of that cheap bootleg whiskey to cause those delusions? Well, I may find that this is a time for me to say goodbye to you because I know that they don't like me to be gone so long. They lock me in my room and give me my medication at night. Most days, I know that Scott's been gone a long time, but some days he comes back to me. I look down the tracks and I see him hurrying to me. In his darling rumpled trousers, Scott's hurrying to me. Those days, we sit under the vacant shadows of these trees and look out on the distant fields together. And I think, in my mind somewhere, I am getting better. Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, so is he, blackbird, bye bye. Thank you very much. Thank you. My name is Deborah Connor, and I come to you from the other mountain state, West Virginia. So we have something in common. But let me answer your question right off as to how Zelda and Scott died, because obviously when I'm in character, I try to maintain that in-character persona, and so I have to evade questions that Zelda could not have known. Scott died first. He died in 1940. He was 44 years old. Now, Scott died completely forgotten as a writer. And I hope that you'll be able to come Sunday evening and hear me give a talk about Scott's literary and emotional collapse. It's called a period in his time, the crack-up period. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will show and describe the collapse of their lives, because it's important to remember. I think this is a good a simple way to think of the Fitzgeralds' lives, because their lives parallel what was going on in American society at the time. The 1920s was a time of exuberance, a time of success, and that was true in the country, in the economy, and also in the Fitzgeralds' lives. But by 1930, that had all collapsed with the stock market collapse. The same thing happened to the Fitzgeralds. Zelda was hospitalized for the first time in 1930 at age 30, and she did spend the rest of her life mostly in mental hospitals, although she was able to leave from time to time. Scott died in California. He and Zelda did remain married, although he was not faithful to her. Keep in mind that when Scott was desperately in debt. So in the 1930s, the movie industry promised far more money than could be made by writing novels. So Scott went to Hollywood to capitalize on working in the movie industry. He was a contract writer for a variety of different Hollywood companies. And he only had one real success as a screenwriter for a company. He did, however, work for a time on Gone with the Wind, but he was fired because he kept trying to change Margaret Mitchell's text, her words. The movie company wanted, Selznick Studios wanted her words preserved in the movie. Scott kept wanting to change them because he didn't think she was a very good writer. So Scott was living in Hollywood. He was living with a woman named Sheila Graham, who was I'm going to take these off because they're going to fall off. She was a journalist, but more or less a kind of gossip columnist, Hollywood gossip columnist. And she is credited really with getting Scott sober in the last couple of years of his life. However, even though he was still a relatively young man, only 44, his health had been irreparably damaged, and he died of a heart attack in her apartment. He was eating, and I find this an unforgettable bit of trivia, he was eating a Snickers bar when he died. Every time I go to the drugstore or the grocery store and I see a Snickers bar, I always think of Scott. So he died of a heart attack. Zelda is still alive. She lives until 1948, and she's 48 years old. She's living in a mental hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, called Highland Hospital. One night, March 11th, the dumbwaiter in the downstairs part of that hospital caught on fire, and the fire spread to the upstairs room, and Zelda and 9 other women perished in the blaze. All of the others who were in the hospital were able to escape, but it's believed that Zelda was locked in her room and there was no hope of escape for those women on the 3rd floor. Their daughter, Scotty, lived until 1986, and she died of esophageal cancer. There are 3 remaining grandchildren. Scotty produced 2 boys and 2 girls. The oldest son of Scotty's, the one that Zelda mentions as having been her new grandson, Thomas, known as Tim, took his own life in the 70s. And sadly, there is a legacy of suicide in Zelda's family. Her brother, her one and only brother, Anthony, committed suicide by throwing himself out a hospital window. This was during the time while Zelda was hospitalized herself. So there are 3 remaining grandchildren of Zelda and Scott, and they are all about my age. And Scott, one of those, Eleanor, has written a book about her mother called Scotty, the Daughter of F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, and it's quite a good book. Scotty is an interesting case because for many, many years, people would ask her what it was like to be the daughter of people whose life was very public and whose tragedies were also very public. Scotty maintained that she was fine. She was not in any way harmed by that legacy. However, in her late years, she began, denial, exactly. She began to be a little more candid. And she said at one point, the only way I could survive the tragedy that was my childhood was to put up in the emotional attic. And her daughter Eleanor said that her mother was emotionally bulletproof. And I think those are very telling statements. Another friend of the Fitzgeralds, when Scotty was still young, said that Scotty was never a child. She was only a 40-year-old widow. Sad, sad. Questions?
What is your background that you did such a great job?
Thank you very much. What is my background? Well, I have to confess that I have a graduate degree in poetry writing, which makes me completely unemployable. So I've had to be creative over the years. I've taught college students, but as I became more and more involved in this business and became more and more involved in traveling, I have since given that up. And this is my career. This is what I do. It's a wonderful job. I think I have more fun with my job than maybe Oprah, although I don't make nearly as much money. I have never been in any plays. I've just learned by making a whole lot of mistakes. Yes.
I just looked into a little history of Scott and stuff, but he apparently was pretty well known and very well liked for helping people like Hemingway. There were others that he helped too, and he seemed to really stand out with that. How do you think Zelda was with all of that? Did that come down to sharing quite a bit of money also with folks when they needed it?
Did Scott and Zelda share any of their money with others? No, because there wasn't ever money. They always outspent anything they earned, even in the years when Scott was making a lot of money. You know, in a year when a school teacher didn't even make $1,000 a year, Scott made like $35,000 a year, equivalent to a couple $100,000 a year, which I think is pretty good money. And remember, that's money as a writer too. It's not easy to make a lot of money as a writer unless you're somebody like Stephen King or something.
And were his short stories published in magazines? That's the way Jack London made quite a bit.
His short stories were published in magazines, yes, and he marketed them in the highest paying magazines. Other questions? Well, I think that will wrap us up. You must have some announcements, Amber. Anything that you want to talk about?
Well, first and foremost, can we give her a round of applause?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have any of you ever been to a Chautauqua performance before? That is what essentially this afternoon is Chautauqua. It's where typically a historian or, in her case, a writer has found out a great deal of information on a character from history's past and gives us a chance to be with that person for even just an hour. If you enjoyed today, this afternoon, and you have family members that you think would enjoy this performance, we're doing it again this evening at 7 p.m. right here in the Riles Room. So that's an opportunity. Again, there will be some fine dining from El Nopal again this evening. And then she will be coming in tomorrow afternoon to present a children's program, but from what I understand, I will be able to also create my own mini masterpiece. Deborah will be presenting Get Squared. It's a children's art workshop on Cubism. Zelda Fitzgerald apparently spent quite a lot of time with Picasso, and so because she was somewhat of an artist, she's going to give us some information on that. She has a PowerPoint and some neat things to do for children. So if you know anyone, please have them come tomorrow. That'll be downstairs on the second floor in our newest area, the Idea Factory. So if you haven't been on the second floor since we redid it, please do so. And then tomorrow evening, I know she alluded to a performance or a presentation on Sunday evening. It's actually tomorrow evening, and that is The Crack Up, Fitzgerald's Decline in the 1930s. So we would love to have you back for that to learn more about the Fitzgerald's life and as their lives somewhat fell apart. It was very interesting. Deborah, thank you so much for being here.
You're most welcome. Thank you for being a wonderful group. Thank you.
And as we leave, Michelle and we have some really neat things back there for you. For spending our month in Paris, we have some great Eiffel Tower bookmarks, so please take one with you. And if you really enjoyed today's event and you want to leave us some feedback about it, please grab one of these that says thoughts, comments about today's program. Okay? Thank you very much and have a great afternoon.